Well, and that just shows you that like there is this much extra layer of complexity when you're dealing with aquatic snakes, and I feel like they are such an underrated thing. And you could have people who are brilliant fish keepers who might want to jump into this world as well, who haven't even really thought of it. Can you quickly, for people listening, just your standard kind of rough definition of what you would like the aquatic snakes versus the semi-aquatics? I think most people will just intuitively
Yeah,
know
yeah.
what this is, but maybe just to lay it out.
Yeah, no, for sure. And what's funny is I've actually spoken at a fish show and I've spoken at fish clubs on this topic because predatory fish keepers are fascinated by them. And I realize no one's really taken them on
Introduce them.
seriously. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
exactly. So I've actually spoken in Florida and South Carolina, kind of been flown around to different fish groups talking about this because they're actually better suited than most herp keepers generally to take on something like this. So when I say aquatic snakes, I'm meaning primarily fully aquatic snakes. The family Homolopsidae, which is a family of Southeast Asian culebroids, are the vast majority of them. Like Homolopsis, rice paddy snakes. Rice paddies are probably the most terrestrial of them in that they'll climb on sticks out of the water at nighttime, but that's about where it ends. The rest of them, I usually offer a landing shelf. But if you see an aquatic snake, a member of the family Homolopsidae, on that shelf, that probably means something's wrong. So I actually only have those in there for two reasons. One, it gives me a plant area to grow pothos, which extracts nitrate and stabilizes the water. But more importantly, two, if the snake isn't feeling well, it's going to go up there. I now know something's up. Let's investigate. If I don't have that shelf, the snake has no way to do that. No way to tell me, hey, I don't feel well. So knowing that their natural behavior is to leave the water when they're ill, I do leave that space, even though in most tanks it will never, ever, ever be used. So for the fully aquatic snakes, that's family Acrocordidae, which is your elephant trunk snakes and your marine fowl snakes, and then Homolopsidae. Most of them are rear fanged, but they're all very, very aquatic. Now, there's a few, I'd say, borderline full aquatic. Some of your helicops are more aquatic than others, which are from South America. But generally speaking, I leave it at Homolopsidae and Acrocordidae because the rest, I'd say you'd really have to deep dive and see how important that land is. Because animals that do have a small portion of their ecology on land, you need to offer to them. Oftentimes, that's important for that fungal cycle. I wish they all crawled out of the water because rice paddy snakes are infinitely easier than the rest. And I think part of it is, well, they often dry out at night. So the fungal pathogens don't have as much time to grip on between shed cycles. So yeah, and that's where I tell people to start too. Like if you want to get into aquatic snakes, don't start an elephant trunk snake, please. I've seen too many of them just not make it past a year. That's a very long-lived animal. It's not supposed to die in a year. Most people think they're doing great because that snake has resting metabolic rate of one heartbeat every other minute. So it takes a really long time for your
Is that
scripts to show
real?
up. Yeah, yeah,
That wow.
the slowest resting pulse of any vertebrate animal. Also, the most thorough digestion of any snake, so they really don't poop. A lot of really weird granulotis have the most blood and the most viscous blood. That's why acrocords are negatively buoyant and sink because they have such thick blood, and their lungs are so vascularized. When you open them up, it doesn't look like lungs. It just looks like bready tissue because they absorb the oxygen, they exhale cutaneously. I mean, they're amazingly weird adapted animals, but because of that, they're also very particular in captive care. And everyone thinks they're cool and wants to start there. And it always pains me when I see it. And I see it all the time. Anytime someone has a problem with the granulotus, it feels like whether and around the world, I've had rescues in the Philippines and Australia. They're like, hey, what do I do? And it's like they're already at the point where it's almost too late or too late. If I have one message for anyone that's like, I want to get into aquatic snakes, please, for crying out loud, start easy because it's not an easy part of the hobby. I've worked with some of the more difficult terrestrial herps and I put them on their own special level. Now, tentacle snakes can be easier. I'd say that's mid range, but if I tell anywhere to start, it's like puff faced water snakes. They come in pretty colors. They come in morphs. They're pretty durable. They're less prone to issues with sopranidae. So goldfish and minnows, they're carp. They have thymidase. Garter snakes are super sensitive to thymidase. A lot of species are. Homolopsidae aren't that susceptible. Like they're not affected acutely with the neurological issues. Some people have kept them full time on that. It is a part of their natural diet. I did try one colony of full time goldfish because the readily available fish. And I said, let's try it. If I notice issues, obviously add B1 and pull it back. But let's see what happens because I knew a very, very respected breeder who knows his stuff who's only feeding goldfish. What I did find was by year four, I was getting a lot of slugs, and then it became all slugs. So it did affect reproduction, and I do think it has some impact. But the nice thing about your puff-faced water snakes is a goldfish every now and then isn't going to kill them like it will the rest of them. Rice paddy snakes, the nice thing is they're small. They're 10 inches. You could do an air filter, a sponge filter like you do for shrimp and some
Mm.
sticks, and they do just fine. Just plant up a tank. They do well in bog tanks. So I'd say you start at rice paddy snakes or puff-faced water snakes. You work in some anhydrous, and then maybe try something like a tennant snake and herpeton, where now you're dealing with black water, and now you're dealing with specific pH because tentacled snakes need specific pH. They need black water, or they do have fungal outbreaks. And I will say that I have one colony that right now is showing signs of fungal because during breeding season, when they're chasing each other around, that adds stress, and so you have to separate them back out if you start seeing the health decline. Which is another thing about breeding aquatic snakes. Most of these species, I forgot to add this. One of my favorite things is most of these species do better in groups.
Mm.
When you find, say, Homolopsis in Indonesia, you tend to find 20. When you find one, you just find the one spot they're at. The most snakes of any one species I've ever seen in any one night was Cerberus, Bacadams, in Indonesia, Schneideri. And we lost count before 400, but probably hit somewhere in 400 in a single night of the same
Wow.
species. These are animals that actually do well in groups. Additionally, they need a lot of fish in their tank. They're not always the best feeders, but having multiple snakes going after the same fish causes chaos and it allows them to feed better. So on tentacled snakes, if you have one tentacled snake in a tank, its feed success is significantly less than if you have four. Problem being during breeding season, they have to watch them very closely. The males will start losing weight because they're not eating, and the females will start stressing and getting fungus. So that's when you then have to separate back into male and female groups as is needed. And that's where we get into tentacled snakes, where you do have those issues. Whereas puff-faced water snakes, if you keep them together their entire lives, the only thing you have to watch out for is the male being too inclined to breed and maybe not eating enough. So
Mm.
in mine, I'll usually have the male go back to his own tank to get his body weight back on. And then once breeding season comes, he just hops from female tank to female tank. But sometimes you have to put him back in his own because they're just so focused solely on breeding. They kind of forget that eating's important too.
Yeah,
Anyways.
yeah. Can you tell us a little bit how, like setting up a tank? I know obviously, just as you're mentioning, it's probably quite a spectrum between species to species, but just in general, like, is it just like setting up a fish tank, or what are you doing?
Yeah, so it does vary species to species. Like with tentacled snakes, you're talking about a black water tank, but there are some general rules that I follow for everything but tentacled snakes. Rule number one is I never fill tank all the way. Three-fourths. I like to have that airspace. It gives them room to breathe. It gives you a spot to put your pothos for nitrate extraction. It gives you a place to put a landing shelf so they can indicate if they're not feeling well. So my basic setup on smaller species, even a Homelopsis, 40 breeder. I get some egg crate and some pond foam. I silicone in the egg crate to the back. I pond foam it. That's what creates that shelf. I fill that with aquatic planting medium. And then filtration can vary species to species. Some species like Homelopsis don't mind flow. So in a 40, I might just throw a fluval U4. I remove the carbon. Carbon strips out tannins. I add tannins to most of my water. Catawba is my preferred tannin of choice, although I also mix in coastal oak and sycamore and a few others. Um, and then a lot of hide. Enough hide that the snakes are hard to find. If you can walk in there and see the snake easily, or see the snake every time you go looking for it, you did it wrong. It should be like you only see them when you see them. That's why you do the feeding station to draw them out, or go in there at night with a flashlight, which is what I do. During the day, you never see them. You shouldn't be able to. That's too exposed. They don't like being exposed. Preferably anything larger, which is what I like to do. Then you do sumps, but you're hanging on the back, the little Tetra filters or the top fin filters that are just carbon. Those are useless.
Mm.
Carbon removes color and it removes odor. It does nothing for your actually nitrate nitrogen cycle. So getting a test kit and making sure you don't have a load of nitrates and ammonia or nitrites in there is going to be really important. A good pH test kit, but yeah, so it is like a fish tank, but there's some modifications. Another modification is substrate. Gravel is not ideal for them. Pool filter sand works pretty good. But alternatively, now that I've moved to an area with really hard water, and I am using RODI for the most part because of that, I've been using a lot of aqua soils, which are volcanic ash compressed substrates, often using a little peat. And like fluval stratum locks the water in between like 6.0 and 6.5. So you don't have to chemically alter the pH. So I have been doing a lot more aqua soils and like them. So substrate's a consideration. Species to species flow is. Do I do an in-tank U4 that's powerhead driven, or do I do a sponge drive? And surprisingly enough, if you have a really planted tank with a thick soil bed, which actually helps a little bit too with the filtration process. I'm running a handful of 40s now on air-driven sponge filters and having phenomenal results because that sponge filter is enough for the nitrites, but the plants are doing all the work for the nitrates. And those stable tanks only need water changes like every year. Still testing the
Really?
values, but not seeing them drift because as long as the plants are growing, they're consuming nitrates. That's
Yes.
why, even though I think pothos are not my favorite plant in the world, to be perfectly honest, I still often will utilize those and other surface plants because the
Mm.
surface plants are growing vines. Chop the vine, constantly chop it all the time. As long as the plant's growing, it's working. Once it fills in the space available, it stops growing, then it's going to stop working, and you might not realize that your kind of natural filtration systems died off. So that's the other reason. Like I do aquatic plants in the water. Certain species it doesn't work well because they tear them out.
Mm.
They're moving around and they're anchoring to them and ripping them out. But those top surface plants where you can trim sweet potato, buy a sweet potato, save a part, let it vine. Excellent for removing nitrates. And then you can get silly and have them coming out the tops of the tanks if you want. I've seen people do Monstera, Adansonii, and a few other species out of their fish tanks to extract nitrates. But utilizing that in an aquatic snake tank is a great way to go because they need the stability.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah. Now,
I'm
what
trying
about?
to.
I was just say, what about like water temperature, and are you heating the water, or how does that work?
Yeah. So that adds a layer of challenge in terms of what you populate the tank with. For example, I do like to add shrimp to my tank, but there's only some species that can handle the heat. So for like tentacled snakes, you're looking at 78 to 82. For a lot of the other species, it's 80 to 84. I do allow like some of the species within further north range to get a little cooler in winter and get down to like a 78 low at night. But for the most part, 80 to 84, varying species to species. For example, my puff-faced water snakes are 82 to 84 most of the year. In the winter, I let them get a little cooler. But there's not a huge temperature variant in their native range, and I haven't seen a huge change in reproduction results. Also, they're not something you have to cycle. They're going to breed. If they're healthy, they're going to breed and reproduce. These are very reproductive animals. The challenge isn't getting them to breed. The challenge is actually getting them to stay alive.
Mm.
But that higher temperature does pose a challenge to certain plants, fish, and shrimp. So I'd say if you're looking into this, make sure each species you look into what are their temp requirements because it's easy to mismatch pH and temperature. And that's the other thing. Most of these snakes are going to be a pH below 7, anywhere between 6 and 7 is the pH range, but the vast majority prefer. And so that was going to change which fish do and don't work as both your cleanup crews and your feeder fish. And the reason I add that extra other fish is because in a normal fish tank, you use catfish to rummage around the bottom, and you need something to stir that up because when it gets really densely planted and you have all your manzanita wood in there and everything else, it's hard to properly clean it. So having an animal actually stir that up is an important part of that. But don't do catfish. Why? Well, there's a dorsal spine. Don't do Plecostomus. Why? If your snake swallows it, it might die. That's when you end up in crustaceans. Now you're looking at panther crabs. Panther crabs are good. A lot of other crabs, like red claw crabs at PetSmart, are aggressive towards the snakes. It's a no-go. So there's a lot of layers to it depending which species you want to pursue. But that's also the fun research part. That's the fun part where you get to deep dive in crabs and go, I guess I'm going to learn everything there is to do to learn about crabs because I need a cleaning crew. But I use a lot of panther crabs. I use some red apple crabs more for entertainment purposes on those guys. But the red apples will clean up dead fish pretty
Mm.
quickly. So I love throwing those in because like if they'll hang out on the top and then just like grab stuff off the filter intake and use that as food, and I don't have to feed the crab, but it's keeping my intake clean. Like I said, the cherry shrimp are great little scratcher around. I'm not sure how effective they are. Mono shrimp are better for algae, but they do end up on the snakes, so I leave them because it seems like that might have a benefit. And then fiddler crabs are fantastic cleaning crabs that leave everything alone. Red claw crabs could not recommend. Vampire crabs inappropriate. They're not really carrion feeders. They do great on crickets. I've actually filmed them for a show. So, but there's a handful of those. So yeah, it's layered. The other thing I didn't say though is you do need a secure lid, and fish tanks don't come with
Mm.
those. So you're going to find yourself buying aquarium silicone and sponge and filling in the holes while your plugs go in. And the other thing is the regular tube heaters can be dangerous to aquatic snakes. So
Yeah,
like your
that's what I
quartz
was thinking.
heaters, They might wrap around them. They could burn themselves, as snakes do. If you had like a hot rock or anything else, they're often not great about not burning themselves. But there's been innovations there. So the company Higer makes these dual tube in a plastic case where they aren't really in direct contact with it. And I've had no issues with those. And the thermostat's external, which is important because if you're not running an external thermostat, way too many people, including myself, I actually lost my first massive colony of Homelopsis years ago from a heater overheating and turning the water to like 105 degrees when I got home. And of course, the snakes were cooked. So having that external thermostat on your heater is super important because otherwise you'll be like the rest of us. And at some point, your heater's going to go bad and you're going to cook your animals, and that's a hard day.
Yeah, that's definitely good advice. And the feeders you had mentioned. So when you're, is there certain species of fish that you consistently use, and how does it work? Do you just throw a bunch in and then you're waiting for the fish population to be decreased until you add more?